welcomes. Thank you very much for joining us, all of you at this early hour. I'd first like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we're all dialing in from. For those of you in Sydney, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm personally dialing in from North Yuin country on the south coast. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, and of course, extend our respects to anyone on today's call who identifies as an Indigenous Australian. I'll just take note of the attendance, and we'll try to track all the guests as they join in. But a very warm welcome, of course, to our speaker, to Sue Johnson, Area 1 Director, and Cara Limmer for joining us from the Sydney Club. Thank you. Adriana, if it's all right, we will kick off with you this morning. Thank you for joining us. I'll just give a little background about you and then hand it over to you. We're very excited to hear more about this topic. So Adriana is a modern slavery and AI ethics researcher with QUT, Center for Data Science. She is also the project lead at MIA Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute. Adriana won the IRC AI Artificial Intelligence Award in 2021 for her work using artificial intelligence to combat modern slavery. Through her research, Adriana is applying machine learning and analyzing and benchmarking the business reports published following the Modern Slavery Act from the UK and Australia. Adriana is the newly appointed Brisbane Community Lead for Women in AI in Australia, working towards increasing female representation and participation in artificial intelligence. Very excited to hear from you this morning. Thank you so much for joining us, Adriana.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a really great pleasure to meet you all. I am going to check very briefly if you can all see my screen. Perfect. As we got introduced, today I'm going to talk a little bit more about my work that sits at the intersection between artificial intelligence and modern slavery. And before I dive into the project itself, I would like to maybe start putting a definition to the term modern slavery, just for those that are maybe a bit unfamiliarized with the term. Because maybe if you haven't heard about the term modern slavery as such, I'm sure you have heard about human trafficking, for instance, which is is a term that is it's a lot more used, for instance, in the US. But the term modern slavery actually encompasses any situation of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave from because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, or abuse of power. So then when we look at this term as such, we see it as an umbrella term that surely encompasses the situation of human trafficking, but also forced labor, bonded or debt bondage, bonded labor, descendant-based slavery, domestic servitude, forced child labor, the use of child soldiers, forced and early marriages, slavery-like practices, even organ harvesting, and even more. So we are looking now at a very large type of crime that can take many forms across the globe. In the Sustainable Development Agenda, there is actually a target that is looking directly at this issue, and that's the target 8.7. So this gives us the international framework under which we can all come together and work against modern slavery. And here I quote that the target asks upon all states to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst form of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldier, by 2025, and end child labor in all its form by 2030. Well, we are almost finishing the year 2022. So under such a close deadline, what can we say we do to achieve this goal? Well, we need to first understand the scale of the problem. And while measuring modern slavery is truly a very hard task because it's a hidden crime, we have organizations such as the Walk Free Foundation that for years they've been leading this work on putting out the global estimates of modern slavery. And they're working now in partnership with the International Labour Organization, the International Migration Organization. And they actually put out their statistics in early September. And these statistics show us that now there are 50 million people in the situation of exploitation. So on any given day in 2021, there are over 50 million people in modern slavery. This is really shocking for us because the 2017 statistics, there were only 40.3 million. So we only saw in a couple of years an increase of over 10 million people being exploited. So when we break down those statistics, we see that 27.6 million are in forced labor and 22 million in forced marriages. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to try to bring this gender dimension to my talk so we can make the link with the purpose of this group. And we see that actually, while in forced labor, the majority of the victims are men, but we still have over almost 12 million people that are women and girls in forced labor in the world. However, when we look at forced marriages, we see that over 2/3 of the ones that are forced to marry are female. But looking back at the forced labor issue, we know that forced labor can be state imposed, and we see this in some of the more totalitarian regimes. Nevertheless, those global estimates show us that a total of 17.3 million adults and children are in forced labor imposed by the private actor in sectors other than commercial sexual exploitation, which give us a great indication that those people are working directly for the supply chain of big corporations and end up in the products and services that you and I are consuming every day without knowing. But before I dive deeper into the issue of forced labor and what businesses and governments are doing, I would like to emphasize a little bit more again on the gender dimension, because forced labor in the private economy has a very important gender dimension. Because women in forced labor are more likely than their male to be in domestic work, while the male are mainly to be in forced labor in construction sector, for instance. But what is more importantly, women are also more likely than men to be subjected to physical and sexual violence and threats against their family. And women are more likely to be coerced through wage non-payment and abuse or vulnerability, while men are more threatened with violence and financial penalties. So it is very important to acknowledge this gender dimension when we look at those statistics and these numbers, because this can influence the type of solution that we can find. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of my presentation. But when we look at why people are enslaved, it's important to acknowledge that modern slavery is a crime, and is not only a moral crime, but is also a financial crime. For a very long time, it was believed that modern slavery, since 2014, there was this estimate from the International Labour Organization that modern slavery generates over $150 billion per year. But in fact, this number is now believed to be only the tip of the iceberg, because while modern slavery was supposed to be the third largest crime in the world after drugs and arms, it believed that now has taken over the drugs crimes in terms of the revenue it generates. And the reason for this is that it is now cheaper than ever to trade in human beings. And as Kelvin Bales put it, people do not enslave people to simply be mean to them, but they're doing this for a profit. So it's truly important for us to understand what both businesses and governments are doing to respond to this. And it's not only the responsibility to apply law and implement due diligence and create transparency on the measures that they are taking to eliminate and prevent modern slavery from their supply chain and from the market in general, but it is also a great opportunity for businesses to be able to address the issue of forced labor in supply chain. They need to understand the business opportunity that they are having. And it's very clear that a business that is looking to survive in the next decades needs to start including ESG's, environmental social governance metrics, in their strategy. And addressing modern slavery, it is a key component in addressing the S in the ESGs. But more importantly, it is going to provide businesses with a clear understanding of their supply chain, creating more resilient supply chain, not only against the issue of modern slavery, but for other crises that are to come. On the government side, we saw that while self-regulation for businesses was a good step forward, unfortunately, they have not moved fast enough, and therefore the governments had to intervene. So we have seen that the first government to take a national stand against modern slavery was the UK, with the passing of the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. This was the first national legislation requiring big corporations to publish one statement per year where they describe the structure of their supply chain, and they explain the steps they're taking to ensure that modern slavery is not part of the supply chain. And since then, we also have a Modern Slavery Act here in Australia. But what we have noticed is that there has been this domino effect, which actually started in California in 2010, but that was only at state level. But we see now at the national and international level the domino effect of passing modern slavery-like legislation, smaller or larger in scope, to the point that the entire European Union now is looking at passing a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. So we're only going to see more and more similar legislation being required across the globe, and not only in the North or in the developed world, but also we see now that Japan is looking into developing human rights due diligence legislation. So we are seeing that more governments are starting to pay attention into look into how they are ensuring that the companies that are operating in their territory or jurisdiction are addressing modern slavery. And here we can go back to this if we want to understand a little bit more in depth of which of the other national legislations, but just want to provide that there are some strong legislation in place or some in the pipeline. So going back to the UK Modern Slavery Act, the company's been asked since 2015 to publish statements. They have been publishing the statements. Now, who is looking at those statements? What do we understand out of those statements? Well, we are expecting thousands of statements each year from the UK alone. And the Walk Free Foundation, in partnership with Wikirate and Business and Human Rights Research Center, they've been leading this work where they try to take samples of those statements and try to analyze them and try to see what are the trends in different sectors. So they first look at the hotel sector, the financial sector, and more recently at the garment sector. And from this type of analysis, we can get some really great insights into what different companies are doing, or what is that industry, where the companies are situated in their industry. So we can see how many of these statements are meeting the minimum requirements outlined by the legislation, how many of the companies are actually looking for modern slavery risk, how many of them are addressing the risk, and we can do this analysis, for instance, looking at, as in this report, they see that 61% of the luxury companies address modern slavery risk compared to actually 85% of non-luxury companies. So this argument that if you go and buy from a cheaper store will mean that you are actually contributing more to modern slavery might not be supported by data, because it is no guarantee that if you go to a luxury store, though this actually, just because the products are more expensive, it means that this difference in price have went into ensuring more sustainable sourcing. So those are really great insights for us, because it really helps us maybe demystify a few of those general beliefs. And then it shows us what investors are doing when looking at the risk of slavery, and how many of the companies provide support for their workers, and many other policies. So diving into these reports is really providing us with a great source of information, not only at a company level, but even at the sector level. And it's not only for the consumers, but also for investors and for the companies themselves to understand where they're situated in the market. Well, having the opportunity to read those reports have been presented a great chance for the civic society and governments to hold businesses to account, and even more importantly, to celebrate the businesses that are doing well and really the industry. It presented us with a great challenge, and that challenge it is that those governments and institutions just simply do not have the time and resources to go through all those reports. The reports are the statements of the company. The reports I was just showing you before only have a couple of hundred statements that they were able to analyze. But in each year, we have over 70,000 modern slavery statements published alone from the UK, around 5,000 from Australia. And as I said, we have this domino effect of more and more legislation being passed. So at the moment, from what we know from our partners at WalkFree and WikiRate, it takes approximately 1 hour to go through one statement and validate all the reports. And therefore, simply, we do not have the right resources and to be able to analyze at scale and create transparency and accountability at scale. And we need to do that because in order to evaluate the real level of compliance, we need to understand the impact of this legislation and drive intervention and eradicate modern slavery from supply chain. We need to document all the statements, because documenting the impact of the new legislative act is an indispensable tool if we want to improve the effectiveness of the legislation, but also to advance the business practices. Therefore, we need a scalable solution, and automatizing this process of analysis is crucial and maybe the only solution we have at the moment to achieve accountability and transparency at scale. And this is where this project that I'm going to present, I want to talk to you about today, enters the scene. Project AIMS, which stands for AI Against Modern Slavery, which even if in this slide, we got the name when we launched this project in partnership between the WalkFree Foundation and the Future Society, which is a Harvard-based think tank, in 2020. In fact, this project started around 7 years ago when I was still in university, and I wrote my two theses, my bachelor and my master thesis on the topic. And I built the first prototype, and then with those two wonderful organizations, I got the chance to scale it and to build the first experiments. And this is when we all start working together in April 2020 to look into how can we take that prototype to a better, more sound format that allows us to read through the statements. So what we mean by looking into the statements is that in the first stage of Project AIMS, we are looking at the UK statement. So we were going through each of the statements. We were trying to look at those metrics that were outlined by the legislation. So we wanted to see if the statement is signed, if it's approved by the board, if the statement describes the structure of the supply chain and the operation of each business, if the company has run risk assessment, risk mitigation, risk identification, how are they dealing with incidents of modern slavery, if they have a whistleblower policy in place, and training for their employees, for instance. So each of those for us were different metrics. And the objectives that we set for this project in this partnership were threefold. First, we wanted to build an open source tool that simply helps us decrease the time it takes to go through these statements. Secondly, we want to provide policymakers and legislators with a greater understanding of how can these type of new methods can be fostered even in other contexts, such as other non-financial reporting initiatives. And thirdly, we really wanted to bring people with diverse discipline and different type of stakeholders in adding their expertise into such a multidisciplinary project and to help us build AI for social good and bring their expertise in the fight against modern slavery. So the first phase of the project was looking mainly at the data collection and data extraction. And we published our first paper in the AAAI journal, and we have collected here most of our learnings. Maybe I will come back to this in the Q&A part, or I will be able to share this with you. And now we're working on a second paper where we are looking more at the learnings from the annotation process of the data and also the pathways for machine learning experiments that we can develop further. And this we've been working on in partnership with scientists from NILA, the Quebec AI Institute. And we're very proud to say that since December last year, we have made our work open source. It's available on GitHub, and here you can find all of our initial experiments for all the metrics. This can be something that anyone can come and look at and maybe pick up a project as a student and try to write their thesis on, or there are plenty of ideas that can be generated from here. And that this project was awarded with the UNESCO International Research Center on AI Award 2021 for its potential in the fight against modern slavery using AI. And moving forward, so once we made the project open source, we decided to take now a different direction for the project, and that direction is research-based. So that's why I'm extremely grateful to say that I have now the opportunity to develop the next phase of the project in partnership between Queensland University of Technology and MILA, but also with the support of the Australian Attorney General's Department, because from now on we're looking at the Australian modern slavery statement. So we need their advice in developing this because they are in charge of the Modern Slavery Act in Australia. And also, of course, with our long-term collaborators, the Future Society, Walk Free, and WikiRate. I know I am just in time, so I would like maybe to ask if I have 2 more minutes to wrap up with the angle with violence. Perfect.
Absolutely, please go ahead.
So as I started this presentation, we understand that modern slavery is a very complex issue. It has a huge gender dimension. This project, it is addressing a tiny bit of the solutions that we need to tackle such a complex global issue, but it is a very important step that we need to take if we want to be able to engage companies and governments and to create that transparency and accountability at scale. But we know that this is not an overall encompassed solution because in fact, modern slavery is really multidimensional, and it sits at the intersection between many disciplines if we are to find the right solution. And here I wanted to say that I wanted to bring back this element of how this is linked with violence against women. And we know that women are, well, maybe in different formats of modern slavery, women are not the ones that are the most exploited. Regardless of the form of modern slavery, women face additional risk in slavery situation from sexual violence, from their trafficking, having to bear children, from rape by their masters in a traditional slavery country such as Mauritania, to extreme isolation, especially if they're migrant or working women as domestic workers in the private homes, or as we've learned, the girls that are forced to marry at very young age with very little freedom offered by their husband or their in-laws. Now the situation gets even darker because we know that even after women escape slavery, embedded gender prejudice means that victims experience further discrimination. We saw how in Lebanon, for instance, the migrant women who escape abuse of their domestic employers are often targeted by the police officers seeking sexual favors in exchange for not reporting them as criminals, because there is still this issue of victimizing of criminalizing the victims of modern slavery. In Libya, there have been reports of rapes by male guardians of the female migrant detention at the detention centers, or in Mauritania or Niger, women face additional obstacles to provide their children with education and access to healthcare and any other public services because they lack the right documentation. So not only is that the women face risk while being in a situation of exploitation, but things are actually very difficult for them even once they escape the situation of modern slavery, and it's a very high likelihood that they are being then faced with the same vulnerability that they had in the first place and end up being in modern slavery again. So if we want to eliminate modern slavery, we have to look at the holistic view. So we have to do a lot to end discrimination against women and girls, and that is it is embedded in the situation of modern slavery. And we saw that there was a really great progress when forced marriage was acknowledged as a form of slavery, but it's not sufficient. And if we want to tackle the most serious forms of violence against women and girls, which modern slavery is certainly one of those, we have to tackle a wider range of discriminating practices, even seeking that they seem very subtle and culturally subtle. So as women and girls are disproportionately affected by in the situation of exploitation and beyond, if we want to write the right legislation and policy response, we have to add our gender lens, including gender-sensitive laws, policies, programs, and budget, including gender-responsive social protection mechanism, and very importantly, we need to have provide this access to all migrants, because they are ones that are a very high level of vulnerability. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for sticking with me for a couple more minutes. And I'm really looking forward to hearing if you have any questions, and also to say, please stay in touch. And I look forward to learn more about all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. That was very insightful, and some of those numbers there are shocking, from the number of people who are in the modern slavery situations through to the cost from in 2009, that information that you had there. I'll open it up for all of our guests to ask questions, and I just thought I'd start with one. From your research and data thus far in analyzing the statements, do you have any indication of how effective the modern slavery acts are?
Sure. So it's I will start by saying that the modern slavery acts, especially the one in the UK, being the first of such, was very revolutionary. And it's not only targeting the transparency and supply chain part, it also has a more holistic view with access to remedies for victims and prevention, etc. But we're looking mainly at this part of transparency and supply chain, addressing the responsibilities of companies. And I can say that this first legislation will only ask a company to publish one statement with the signature on their website, and therefore it can be an empty page with the signature on your website and you are compliant by law. And even if you don't do that, there is absolutely no, only the Secretary of the State can bring a company to a court, but it never happened since 2015. So the philosophy of this legislation were that the companies are so competitive in nature that the moment one company publishes a statement, the next one is going to do more and more and more, and it's going to create this race to the top. Well, we saw that this didn't happen in the UK. Then Australia passes a legislation 3 years later, so they've learned from the UK and they build a better legislation. So it says it's not enough just to have a signature, you also have to add these 6 elements in there, like you have to present to us these 6 criteria. Now, the reality is that a lot of studies from Australia show us that even in Australia, we can call it at best a race to the middle, because a company will do just as a little bit more than their competition in the field, but they would not go too deep into being transparent. But there are some companies that are doing quite well. So the legislation were effective in the sense that they created discussion. They brought the issue of modern slavery at the board level. At companies, they created this this effect of companies trying to talk about it. It gives us an opportunity to have those public documents that are not proxy data. This data comes directly from the company. Yet what we need to do, and this is the direction that now the European Union, after they've learned from all the different other legislation, they're moving towards a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, meaning that it's not enough for you, the company, just to say what they're doing. Now they have to provide the evidence that what they're saying is true. So while the legislations, maybe those 2 legislations didn't meet their initial intended goal fully, they created a lot of precedent, and a lot of progress has been made since, but we would say it's not fast enough considering what we're dealing with.
Sure. Interesting. Thank you so much for that. I'll open the floor to others who would like to address Adriana with a question. Go ahead.
Adriana, Carolyn here. I'm fascinated to know a bit more about Australia and our record on reporting. And are there, I know you referred to the federal government and the Attorney General's Department, but is there a state overlay as well, or is it all just federal reporting, not state-based?
So this particular legislation is federal legislation. Nevertheless, the New South Wales have been progressing. They have some more work done in this. They started a few years ago, but this type particularly looking at transparency in supply chain for Australian companies at the federal level. All the documents can be found in the Modern Slavery Register. I'm going to put a link in the chat so you can look at them. And then this register used to be under the management of the Australian Border Force, but with the new elections, then now the entire team has moved to the Attorney General's Department. The actual modern slavery legislation is now in the process of review. They're taking submissions to the reviewing process until the 22nd of November. We see a lot of great push from the civic society, businesses as well, to make the legislation stronger. And we are hoping that that will also imply that, for instance, at the moment when you go on this register, you can see all the statements, but all you can guarantee is that the statements are signed and approved by the right board or person of the company. But it's no guarantee that all the statements also include the 6 mandatory criteria, because simply, again, the business team in this now at the Attorney General, they don't have the resources. So that's why we're hoping to aid them in the long run by creating the solutions for them.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Adriana, it's Olivia. I just wonder if there's a point where there's such good disclosure by companies in Australia that there's some kind of symbol or some accreditation that they receive that makes it easy for consumers to identify that they're in full compliance, because that's the easiest way for us to individually drive an economic outcome for companies. Have you and the people that you've been working with been talking about something like that, so that it becomes a very public conversation and can be easily acknowledged in terms of compliance?
That's exactly where we're trying to get to, and to the point where ideally, for instance, let's say we are in this Australian register, and we're not only seeing the companies that are signed and approved, but also that we can also provide this metric saying also this report from Bunnings or their higher I'm not exactly this familiar. I don't know why I got this example with how many companies are under that organization. But let's say this year they've done really well at identifying risks, but they haven't actually talked about how they're engaging with stakeholders. And then the next year we can say, well, look, after this, in the next year they have done more, and now they're complying with all the 5 out of the 6 metrics. So that's why the sooner we start adding these elements of has the company included all the mandatory criteria in the reports, the better we can do this analysis over time. But to get there, I can say from all these learnings and the experience that we have so far, it is really complicated because humans will do it the best, of course, but we don't have those resources. And it's really shocking how under-resourced all the teams that are in charge of these legislations are. And then if we want to automatize, and this is the work that we've been developing, the lack of machine readability of those statements, the different formats that they come into, the fact that the data is all over the place, it just creates so many hurdles for us that we were simply unable, and we've been working on this project for quite a while now, to build the solutions. So to just take this a little bit further. That's why for us, it's not only about building the solutions and hoping to integrate them with those platforms and have that information for consumers and investors, but it's about collecting these learnings and then feeding them back in the review of the existing legislation or in the development of new legislations. So we can tell them from the get-go, try to design this legislation with the element that if you pass this legislation, you also have to monitor the response and how you're going to do that, and why not take advantage of the existing technological tools. And for that, you just have to add one little requirement for these documents to be machine readable, like the financial reporting, and then you have the solution. So we want to get there. We want to have all this information and make it available for the interested stakeholders, but there's so many challenges and hurdles in the way.
Thank you, and congratulations on the work that you're doing. It's
Thank you.
it's groundbreaking work.
Thank you.
My computer has just froze
Oh,
on me.
Shirley's got a question.
Go ahead, Shirley. Sorry, I'll try to solve this.
Adriana, look, that's wonderful. I'm so interested and pleased to hear what progress you're making. I'm a member of the Australian Graduate Women, and Graduate Women International have been working on this for some time, particularly our women in Canada. So I'm just wondering how you're going at getting something into the statements that are going from the Office of Women to the Commission on the Status of Women in March next year, because I think we need very much to have a really good paragraph with appropriate measures to be taken across the world into those statements that come out from the Commission of Status of Women every year. It's a very important issue, and it's wonderful to see Zonta and graduate women and business women working together in New York on those issues. So could you say a little bit about that international work?
So I think I'm a bit unfamiliar with the institutions that you presented and the reports that you presented. So I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure exactly how to answer this question. Do you mind maybe rephrasing it a little bit? Or, yeah, I think I'm just lacking a little bit of the context. I'm sorry for that.
Oh, Adriana, that's my problem. I'm just looking at the international move on this terrible issue for women all around the world, and how we can get international work with the governments who are together in the Commission on the Status of Women, which is a United Nations organization, to bring more pressure on governments around the world about this issue.
So the only thing that pops straight to my head at the moment is this initiative again, led by the Walk Free Foundation about women and girls. And I'm going to put it here in the chat because this is what they've been doing. They've tried to lead these initiatives explaining exactly this, about how this is a gender issue. You saw some of the things that I mentioned today and I referenced come from this, from some of these reports that they're putting there, and they work there with a lot of international partners. So if we go here, so Walk Free, addressing the women particular angle in the situation of modern slavery as an initiative. So this initiative collected quite a few signatories, partners in there. So and then this report, Stacked Odds, is all about women and modern slavery and presenting this gender dimension to the issue. So to be honest, I believe that them and their analysts are the best suited to engage with all these different organizations that you mentioned and bring, because they hold all that knowledge. This is their bread and butter. So that would be my say, that maybe engaging with Walk Free Foundation and the team that led this this report and this initiative will be the best to do so.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I agree with that. That's terrific. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Shirley.
Yeah, so I'm going to add to that one. I can actually confirm, Adriana, that Walk Free Foundation is adding their voice to the Commission on the Status of Women work as well. Yeah, particularly from the Generation Equality Forum. Yeah,
fantastic.
Yes.
any other questions before we move on to club business?
Temre, not a question from me, but
Sure.
more of a statement for Adriana. Obviously, this is a topic that's of interest to us, and thank you for educating us and sharing with us what you're doing. We would love to stay connected and understand at some point if there's anything that we can do from a grassroots perspective to support you and all of the people who are involved in the work that you're doing. So please keep us on your radar so that we can continue to be educated and learn and then provide support where it's relevant.
Good. That's a good point, Olivia. I was actually thinking Adriana would be great for the international convention in 2024, in Brisbane, because Adriana is actually Brisbane based, because it's something I think all Zontians internationally should be able to hear.
Yeah.
So we'll keep you in the loop.
Thank you,
Adriana.
Well,
You're
thank you
amazing.
all so much for having me today. I really appreciate giving me the time to present a bit more about my work and for being so interested in all the great questions. I'm certainly looking forward to staying in touch. And it was a great pleasure to meet you all, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully very soon. And I will unfortunately have to drop now and go to the office, but really lovely meeting you. Thank you again, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Wonderful.
Thank you
Thank you
very
so
much,
much,
Adriana.
Adriana. Have
Okay.
a lovely
Bye.
morning.
Have a good day.